I'm Elizabeth Hartnell-Young, and I'm talking with Professor John Hattie from the University of Melbourne about the evidence industry. John, you have a long history of looking for evidence for education. How did you get into it, and what were your objectives?
Well, what I struggled with in the early days was everybody telling me what worked in education. Academics told me, teachers told me, policy people told me, parents told me, the press told me, and they always had evidence. And it was an intriguing notion, firstly, what the notion of evidence mean, and secondly, everybody had evidence that what they did worked. There was never any negative evidence. It just didn't make sense. So that started the venture of saying, could I change the conversation from what works to the relativity, other things that work better than others? And so yes, I used evidence to help answer that question.
And what sort of evidence were you looking for?
Well, I used the evidence of meta-analyses, the syntheses of many studies. So in that sense used academic literature, most of it based on, all of it actually, based on classroom-based research, because we don't have a history of taking kids into laboratories. And so standing on the shoulders of many others, I was able to build a reasonably large sample size to try and address the question of what is the relative influence.
And you actually had a lot of influence with your publications on evidence. Tell me more about that.
I wished I knew, Elizabeth. It was my 10th book. What happened to the other 9? It obviously hit at the right time. I'd like to argue that it was the story that mattered, but for many they look at that list of various influences and too many stop there, which was not what my intention was, because my argument is that evidence is evidence, but what matters is the interpretation of it. And I worry that we've slipped back to thinking evidence matters as opposed to the interpretation of evidence matters.
How to use the evidence.
Yes.
So it's grown and it's become a big industry, and at the moment even the Australian government is looking at funding an independent evidence institute. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, again, nothing wrong with it provided it's on the right focus. Like, I'm a bit worried that it's going to be a factory turning out academic articles rewritten in teacher language. I don't think that will have much of any effect. I'm not sure that funding more random control trials by itself is necessarily going to make a difference. We have plenty of those already. In fact, many of those in education. I think when I go into schools, they have so much data. And to me, it's about how you can better interpret that evidence, that data not just from the test scores, but data from the student voice. Data from the artefacts of what kids are working on. That's an incredible amount of evidence that teachers are asked to work and absorb and interpret. And if an evidence-based institute is helping that would be very positive.
It has been said that it would take the politics out of education to have an independent institute, perhaps in the UK model. What's your thought around that, though?
I don't think the politics will ever go out of it, nor should it. One of the biggest issues when people talk about an evidence-based institute is sometimes they forget that one of the organisations that perhaps least uses evidence to evaluate what they do is government and policy. And so if it does that, I think it could be really quite positive. I think I'd love to see more comparative trials of various interventions. I can never see it taking the politics out simply because evidence is not neutral. Evidence needs to be interpreted. When you interpret things, you have a politic.
And we are interested in the role of government in this new industry. Where do you see the role of government in future in terms of education policy development and the use of evidence?
Well, I always think back to the first minister who ever spoke about government being involved in the outcomes and the details of schools. And I can trace it back to the mid to late 90s in England. It's a very recent phenomenon. Before that, they were more about the resourcing of schools, curriculum, and kind of the sort of the background work, not the day-to-day inside schools. But that has been a phenomenon of the last 20 years. Parts of me want to go back to those days. Parts of me doesn't. And so I'm very nervous at the moment about how it's going to unravel in terms of what government's role is. My view is that schools should be the unit of analysis that are aided, assisted and accountable for the defence of their interpretations of the evidence. What's happened, though, is governments have asked the schools for the data and not the interpretations, and we have a massive industry that's made very little difference to the learning lives of kids.
And I would suggest not just governments. There are many other companies, organisations aiming to help schools. There's a lot of players in this ecosystem, aren't there?
There is, and we've got a whole new language like data literacy, which I do not like at all because it implies that teachers have to learn our language. There's lots out there now, particularly with the internet. You can create report after report after report, no attention to the quality of the reports as long as they look pretty. And then you blame the schools once again. People who are taking data out of schools and doing the interpreting as opposed to what I'd like to see happen, help the system, help the schools do the interpreting. So yes, it's a massive business that's growing like crazy.
And where do the universities fit in all this?
They're one of the industries. And certainly they are very willing and keen and have been to do the research, to do the evaluation. And I think obviously, given I'm in one, I think they have a major role to do that, to help with that interpretation, to teach those kinds of skills. It's just got to get away from the notion that evidence is a big pile of stuff. And that's unfortunately how it's often seen.
And do you have a good relationship with government?
Well, I do, because I am the government-appointed chair, independent chair of the Australian Institute for Teachers and School Leaders, and so I get to meet all the ministers and director-generals on a reasonably regular basis and indeed responsible to the Federal Minister of Education.
And you have good influence.
Well, I like to use the influence of the board to try and improve the quality of teachers, school leaders and initial teacher education. And I've thoroughly enjoyed the 5 years I've been doing it.
Or are there things that haven't worked out as you'd hoped in terms of the evidence industry in Australia?
There is still a tendency to say, just give me the money and leave me alone. And certainly in the politic, that is unacceptable, particularly given the accountability has come and stayed, for good or bad. And so at the moment we are still looking for shiny baubles. We're still in, particularly in Australia with the school choice debate so high, we're into massive branding and competition. And in many times evidence goes out the window when you have that kind of branding. So there's a massive conflict out there between the incredible amount of evidence we have, which we selectively pick to advertise, and the evidence we need to truly make a difference to what happens in the classroom.
I think that's a really important point. So is this industry going to be able to pick up your concerns?
I struggle because one of the other problems is that evidence is should be a very contested word. Like every teacher has 10 to 20 years of evidence based on their experience, and we should not deny that as evidence. It is evidence. It's like data and numbers. That's evidence. What matters is our biases, our interpretations of our experience or of the other evidence, and that is not highlighted. So much is how do we build piles and piles of more data and evidence, and I think that will swamp us. It'll create a massive industry, and sooner or later we'll blame the schools for not using it, but I think it misses the point. It's how do we help teachers and school leaders to be more evaluative interpreters of this information. Mrs. Google has provided so much data. It is the interpretation of that data on Mrs. Google that matters. Same with evidence.
So what's going to happen in the future then in terms of governments and education and all the other players in the game using evidence? What's your crystal ball?
Well, I would like to see us get smarter about doing more comparative studies. Why do we do this rather than that, as opposed to let's put an intervention and see if it works or it doesn't work. There are many, many interventions in education. Quite a few of them are not related to the actual diagnosis of what's happening in the school. So evidence about diagnosis, I think, is just as important about evidence about interventions. I don't think we're as good at implementation. Evidence about fidelity and dosage of implementation, and obviously evidence at the end about the evaluation of what happens. Those are four: the diagnosis, the interventions, the implementation, the evaluation, all require evidence of different kinds, all require massive evaluation. I want school people to be evaluators more than they are researchers, and that evaluation asks, so what? And that's the key question.
And is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think it's a very exciting time for evidence, provided we see it as contested, provided we see it as the interpretation. It's wonderful that we are introducing this, and there are so many schools I work in that are stunningly good at using their evidence to look at diagnosis. I visited one just this last week where the young students in primary schools were looking at the evidence based on the school data. and being involved in helping interpret it from their perspective, I think it's a very, very healthy move. As long as we don't keep adding to the pile, but we actually start to have more bloodhound-like eyes sifting through and understanding what it means to the learning lives of kids, it's a very healthy move.
But aren't there two issues around that? There's the time for teachers to actually learn to interpret the evidence, and then how to share it with others.
Well, yes, but time isn't really the issue. It's priority. And many of the schools now that are very good at interpreting the evidence in front of them, they have the same time as those that don't. So they've chosen to give up some things to have this as a priority. But the other half of what you ask, sharing, that's a really hard part. Like collective efficacy, working together is not easy, but that's where great school leaders can make the difference, to reduce the whiff of accountability, to enhance the trust so that you can actually look and ask the tough questions about what worked, what didn't work, what we need to do next.
So you're suggesting governments should leave it up to the schools?
I think they should be empowering the schools to do it. Yes, absolutely, because that's where it makes the difference to kids. I certainly think governments should be doing it to themselves. They should be continually evaluating their own, and I think that would be a very healthy move if we could have an independent evaluation in government of the whole system of what they do, because they should not be immune from this whole debate.
And who would do the independent evaluation?
Well, there are some examples. There is an example in New South Wales of SESI that is doing this as a quasi-independent government board. There are examples in other countries of evaluator generals that are starting to do this. My biggest worry, though, is it'll turn into a debate about method. Like random control trials will be the answer. They are not the gold standard. Beyond reasonable doubt is the gold standard. There are many random control studies that are terrible. And so I'm disappointed if that's where they go. And that would be my fear. Now, one of my worries at the moment is that if you look at the Education Endowment Fund and you look at the similar organisation in America, there's 140 odd different random control trials they've done in the last few years. 140 odd. On average, because they sift in terms of quality of studies, each of them is based on 2 articles. And the average effect size of those 141 random control studies is 0.03. So if you choose, as in the US you are forced to choose, if you are to choose for one of those random controls, you must choose one based on very limited evidence that doesn't work. I think that's a serious problem when we put method above beyond reasonable doubt.
Thank you, John Hattie.
Yeah.